The Zone Coverage Podcast Network.
Wolves Wired Podcast, live from Houston, Texas.
Welcome to Houston, baby!
I still haven't found that, or you still haven't shown me that actual. It's a Tracy McGrady commercial. Is that correct?
It's a joke that's funny to me.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad it's funny to somebody. Oh, that's harsh. I'm sorry. Anyway, yeah, we're in Houston. Thanks to Zone Coverage, Tom Schreier, the best. For more coverage like this, we should probably throw out that you can now be a Zone Coverage member, subscriber. You can be a free member, which just includes, I think,
a newsletter.
The newsletter, you throw your email in there, you read the articles, you hear the podcast, etc. And then there's also a paying membership, a premium membership, whatever you want to call it. You can do it for $25 a year or $3 a month. That gives you more access to things like Zone Coverage's draft guide, which I've read, and it's amazing. It's super in-depth, and it puts a lot of pressure on us for when the NBA draft comes around.
Yeah, and Tim and I are going to keep churning out Timberwolves stuff even when the Timberwolves season ends after they win the NBA championship. And so we're going to continue to have Timberwolves content throughout the summer. And I don't know if you've enjoyed Wolves Wired, you enjoyed the written work and the YouTube work or whatever that Tim and I have done. It's just a good way to support us in a journalism industry that can be tough to pay writers' salaries. And we both feel very thankful to have this job, but there's bills to be paid. So if you can, we would love the subscriptions, and we promise to bring the best possible Wolves content that the two of us can bring.
Yeah, and like you said, the Timberwolves are on track to winning the championship, led by Derrick Rose so far, actually. So we'll rewind. The Timberwolves lost by 3 points in their first playoff game in a long time, over a decade, playing the number 1 seed Houston Rockets. They were, I think, a tenth of a point per 100 possessions behind Golden State for the best offensive rating in the league. Mm-hmm. They're 6th in defensive rating in the league. They were the best regular season team in the league. And,
hands down. And that comes with the expectation that the Wolves were going to get blown out in Game 1, even without Luke Bamute and Ryan Anderson. Mm-hmm. The Vegas spread, if you follow this at all, the spread was 11.5 points, which is just massive. And really, I guess you can call that disrespect for the Timberwolves. That was essentially a bet that the Rockets were going to blow out the Wolves, and that didn't happen. A big part of that reason was the Rockets. They weren't making their threes. I think if they would have came out with their normal level of effectiveness from three, they kind of would have stepped away and maybe blown the lead up to 20 earlier in the game. Mm-hmm. But instead, a 10-point, 12-point lead that the Rockets had kind of dwindled away as the Wolves pressed on. The Rockets were missing threes, and I think that's a point that a lot of people will say going into Game 2 is, the Rockets aren't going to continue to shoot 27% from three, and if they don't, then the Wolves have no shot because they lost when the Rockets made 10 of 38 threes. But I do think it's worth pointing out, it's not just that the Rockets missed them. Mm-hmm. I thought in ways the Wolves defense was impressive.
It was better.
in trying to take that element of the game away. I thought a lot of the way they handled the ball screen action as a team was good. There was more of a focus on trying to be cognizant of where the 4 players that surround James Harden are, and that was what totally screwed the Wolves in the 4 regular season games was kickouts to notably Ryan Anderson. So the Wolves, I thought, did a good job of taking care of those 4 external pieces, but then what happened is James Harden, with more attention elsewhere, there was less attention on James Harden, and he took it to the Wolves with 44 points.
Yeah, and James Harden had 7 threes last night, and to your point, of those 7 threes, how many of them were wide open good threes? James Harden was making absurd shots because he's going to win the MVP, and he's an incredible basketball player. But when the game started, Clint Capella was the instigator because I think to a certain degree, and I wrote about it a couple days ago, their pick and roll is so deadly because they have Chris Paul and you got James Harden as these elite pick and roll ball handlers. You have all these shooters, which generally includes Ryan Anderson, who has killed the Wolves, just waiting and catching and shooting. And then you have Clint Capella, who, when they stay true on the ball handler and the defenders don't come and help and they stay on the shooters, oftentimes Capella ends up with a dunk, a wide open dunk. He's gotten a bazillion alley-oop dunks. He led the league in field goal percentage this year. So early in the game, the Wolves were hard to commit on the shooters, which, they stayed consistent on throughout the game. But Towns I think he struggled with Capella early. I think he had 20 first half points. To Towns' credit, he only had 24 in the game, so he figured it out in the second half. But on top of all of that, and everything you just said, Dane, I do want to mention that the Wolves lost this game by 3, despite Towns having a noticeably bad game. I think 3 of 9, 8 points, something like that. Not a good playoff debut.
I don't think I have any game from this season's memory. The only other time I can think of Towns being that bad was against the Pelicans, where he was in serious foul trouble. It was early on in the season where they were playing Anthony Davis and Boogie, and I think Towns had 6 points in that game. It was just completely removed, but at least you have an out in that game of foul trouble.
Right. Yeah, no, Towns was unquestionably just bad. I don't think there was any foul trouble to really fall back on, but on top of that, Butler, he wasn't bad. He hit some big shots, but he wasn't himself. He wasn't MVP candidate mid-season, or even the Jimmy Butler that we saw in the season finale, where he looked like his old self.
I don't know if he was healthy.
No, I don't either. There's one play in particular that made me wonder if he was healthy. I think it was a Jeff Teague lob, where in any other scenario this year, Jimmy Butler grabs it and he either stays in the air and tries to draw contact and throws it off the backboard and tries to score and either draws the foul, or at the very least he falls back and probably makes the shot. He's done that 1,000 times this year. Or he dunks it. He went up and grabbed it at, his lift looked okay. But he came back down with it, and I think he threw it back out to Wiggins in the corner.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then offensive action started from there. But Butler didn't look like himself. Towns was not himself. He was bad on both ends, especially in the first half. And the Wolves still only lost by 3 to the best team throughout the regular season of the league. So if you want a silver lining from this game, past the fact that they only lost by 3, I think if you want to feel good about Game 2, I think that's a good place to start.
Is that Butler will be more healthy, or
that we've seen Butler play better very recently?
Okay.
To the point where, even on Wednesday, he looked better. He looked healthier. Maybe he's been more hurt since then. I don't know.
Yeah.
But at the very least, I think we can expect more from Towns because, as much trouble as Capella is for a guy like Towns, I just don't expect him to have the same offensive output again. The guys that did show up, Wiggins was great in the first quarter. Really the first half, if I remember right. He produced and he was hitting his threes and he was getting into the basket. He looked better, frankly, than I think I expected. Dane, you wrote about him a little bit. And then Derrick Rose saved them in the middle quarters when they were struggling to keep pace with Houston. I think he finished with 16. He led the team in scoring for most of the game, but he was a huge, huge lift off the bench. And if you were wondering about Derrick Rose and the just general bench rotations, it looks like Derrick Rose is going to be the point guard off the bench right now. Obviously, things can change as time goes on, but I think Rose earned his minutes in this one at least.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of confused as to what will happen with Derrick Rose going forward, because I don't think Derrick Rose would have played the 25 minutes he played had Jeff Teague not been in foul trouble.
Probably. Yeah.
And because what we did see is we saw Tyus Jones check in first for Jeff Teague 7 minutes into the game. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we definitely know that Derrick Rose is the backup. But then once Teague picked up a third foul and couldn't come back in and they had to deviate from the normal rotation, that's when you saw them just stay with Rose, pull Tyus out, and leave Rose in. Rose came in 10 minutes into the game, and he played for 14 minutes the whole rest of the half.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of that was his play, and I think that's what you're pointing to, that Tibbs has more faith in him than Tyus to kind of lead the offense as a point guard. But also then there's this factor of Teague being in foul trouble. I wonder if it might not be different if Teague isn't in foul trouble game 2.
Maybe. The only reason that I wonder if Rose is the guy is throughout the regular season, once they got him, he was always an off guard. Mm-hmm. The second Teague got into foul trouble, at any point in the regular season, I guess Teague hasn't really gotten into foul trouble much this year, so it's hard to go off sample size or anything, but Tyus has always been the backup point guard.
Right.
Rose has always come in as sort of that 2 guard, or I don't know. That he's played in a lot of 3 guard lineups. He hasn't played a lot of primary point guard. In fact, I'm not sure he's played any at all.
I think that's it's interesting because that's the first time we saw that this season.
Exactly, and it came in the playoffs. So that makes me wonder what the rotations are going to look like in game 2.
I'm in agreement with you that Derrick Rose was very important in this game, and energizer that kept the Wolves in it. They were only down at 7 at the end of the half, and I think that was in large part due to Rose and the way he played. But what we saw the Rockets adjust to in the second half was that they would have Harden or Chris Paul on Derrick Rose, and Rose isn't a shooting threat, of course, and so they would just leave Rose wide open, and he would stay on the perimeter, and they would use Harden or Paul to be that double teamer on Towns. And that is, Towns didn't play well, but it was also a clear point of emphasis from the Rockets to bring that double, and you would often see Harden and Paul kind of slide along the baseline if Rose was in the opposite corner and come to chip at a Towns post touch or something along those lines. And Towns struggled with that, but I wonder if that's Tyus Jones, then you have a shooter on the opposite side that Towns can immediately catch and kick to. Yeah. Maybe Chris Paul, maybe James Harden aren't as willing to come and bring that double if we have a player who's more confident in his 3-point shooting ability.
Maybe. And, I also wonder how confident Tyus is in his own 3-point shooting ability, and I wonder how much Houston is taking his 3-point shooting ability seriously in the event that he's the one out there. I mean, throughout the year, he's been a pretty solid 3-point shooter for the last, month and a half or so. He kind of lost that confidence. So I'm obviously still a more reliable and scarier guy to leave open than Derrick Rose. But
my question to you is, if you're the coach and going into game 2 and assuming
Thibodeau or D'Antoni?
Thibodeau.
Okay.
And what do you do with Derrick Rose and Tyus Jones as the backup guards? I mean, it doesn't, obviously they can play some 2 guard. Both of them could play alongside Teague too. Like, what would you ideally like to see for minutes? Because we saw that Tyus played 7.5 minutes and Rose played 24.
Well, there's another guy that I think needs to be part of that equation too, and that's Crawford. If it's me, and this isn't something that I expect Tibbs to do because he's relied on Jamal a lot, and that includes the last game. If it's me, I throw them all out there because, I mean, they all have value in certain things they do. Crawford hit some shots in this game. So early 4. On. Oh, okay. Only 4 shots. Yeah. How many times did he get to the line?
He got to the line twice. He was 4 for 4 from the line. So, yeah.
So, I mean, he was productive offensively.
No, I agree. Degree. He was helpful in that game. And, I mean, he scored more than Jimmy Butler did. So.
Yeah. Well, so I guess for me, I see value in each of their games, but for example, Crawford isn't going to bring it every night. We've seen that a million times. Mm-hmm. Rose hasn't brought it every night. Tyus has been consistent in what he does. So in the event where Crawford is off and or Rose is off, that's when Tyus gets extra burn for me. Because then at the very least, you know that you got a point guard out there that's going to move the ball. But in fairness to Tibbs, I totally see the value. I'm not going to say I'm eating crow on Rose yet, but I totally see the value in when a team needs a spark off the bench. If Rose is getting to the basket and scoring, you got to keep him out there, especially against a team like Houston where they're not great at defending at the rim. Derrick Rose is still very good at getting to the rim and scoring.
Well, and he would defensively, I mean, Harden was doing work on him, but if we just isolate into just focusing on one-on-one defense on James Harden, I thought Derrick Rose did a better job than Andrew Wiggins did. I thought Wiggins, when Wiggins was on Harden, that was really a mess, and Wiggins seemed to be more afraid of him penetrating and beating him or getting beat off the dribble, and that led to numerous step-back threes from Harden. And what I liked about Rose's defense on him, it was very aggressive at the point of attack. Yeah. And Harden still got at him too. But I think if it's not Butler, the next best player to put on Harden is Derrick Rose. As weird as that sounds.
I mean, man, they were using him as a defensive sub last night. They were it was Crawford in on offense and Rose in on defense. Like it's weird that it's come to that, and it's weird that I kind of get it now. Right. It's really strange, but no, I absolutely agree. And Harden, I mean, we all know how good he is, but I thought that his attack was incredibly calculated. The opening quarter and a half, maybe even through the whole first half, I don't know how many threes he took. I'm sure he took plenty. But it felt like, just eye test and memory, his early takes to the basket were a lot more frequent than they were in the second half. I feel like there were more three-pointers in the second half and more looks to take shots from deep. So once he had established his presence in the paint and his ability to get it to Capella, I mean, Capella had 20 points in the first half.
Yeah, and I think too, and I wanted to loop back to Capella at some point, so this is probably good, and I know you and I had talked about this, and you wrote about it with the pick and roll defending Capella there, is just how did Tibbs put it? He's stubborn in setting the high ball screen, coming back and doing it over and over again. Capella, well, even in the midst of one possession. And what was interesting for me is I don't even know that was the way that Capella killed them. It was, yes, they ran high screens for Harden all the time, but where Harden was really hurting the Wolves was just in simple no ball screen action. He's just one-on-one on Wiggins or Butler or Rose, and he's beating them. Exactly, no screen. Exactly. And then so he's past them. He's got him on his hip, and he's getting to the basket, and then Towns has to come up to try and take away that layup. And where Harden and Capella have this great synergy is on those lobs. And so it's kind of similar to the pick and roll, but really they just have numerous ways that they can just involve Capella. And then a third way that I thought Capella, and this was most surprising for me, was he did the Steven Adams, DeAndre Jordan, Marcin Gortat. He was a bruiser on the offensive boards. And that has been a point of weakness for Towns and the Wolves' interior for much of the season. Is those extra offensive rebounds are just killer, particularly when they're just caught and instantly laid back in. And Capella had 5 offensive rebounds in that game, so he's probably you look at Harden's stat line, and that's the guy that the Wolves need to try and do something to slow down. But if Capella is a lob threat, a pick and roll threat, and an offensive rebounding threat, I mean, those are just really high leverage types of shots that he's getting that can just kill the Wolves.
Harden and Paul not so much last night because, I mean, he had an off game, but he was still doing it. They have this ability that once they get in front of the guy that's on them when they're driving, Harden does this thing with his butt. It's like Boris Diaw, but I don't even know what it is, but like he doesn't let
Harden Boris Diaw comp. Love
it. he does. It's the best compliment a person can give. He does this thing where like he doesn't let the defender get back in front of him. I don't.
Chris Paul does that too.
Yeah, exactly. Right. They both do it. So, like when they screen or whatever, it's obviously deadly. But Harden was incredibly good at getting just in front of originally Butler, and then also Rose and Wiggins, depending on who was out there. And once those guys were behind them, he was either going to draw the foul, get a layup, or in a lot of cases in the first half, throw it up to Capella. It was incredible. And I mean, Towns deserves criticism for the way he defended Capella. He gave him a lot of.
I don't think it was that bad. I honestly don't think it was that bad.
I was going to say, like, I'm not sure what Towns is supposed to do. I mean, you can't necessarily give Harden an easy layup, but
normally we can just point at Towns and say, Towns, you effed this up. I didn't see that in the first
game. Once Butler is stuck behind Harden and Harden has a clear lane to the basket, you as the post defender can't just let him glide in there or let Butler draw the foul. If you're the quote-unquote rim protector, you have to do something.
Right, and
That's what
we're
makes
recording
them so
this.
deadly, though.
We're recording this the morning after the game, so I'm gonna go back and take a better look at the Harden shots and assists here to look at that more. But just sitting there at the game watching, I saw a level of discipline defensively from Towns, and this is going to sound weird because Towns had a bad game,
Right?
but we've seen that like 80% of the time Towns is mediocre to bad on defense, but there has been chunks of the season where he is like hyper aware defensively and moving his feet backwards in a effective way. And I saw that in that game. It's just that the Rockets can punish even good defense.
Mm-hmm.
And Towns isn't elite of an athlete enough or big enough in size or crafty enough to really break up those situations where the Wolves are already at a disadvantage. So if he's just playing good or solid defense, Capella and Harden can beat them at that point.
So I guess the question from there is is there a way to minimize that? If Harden is getting past like Jimmy Butler, who is a notably very good defensive player,
well, he was rejecting the screen a lot. So this is the thing. This is what I thought I saw happening, and particularly with Butler, who is the most apt at doing that. Is so like a Capella screen would come up to be set on Jimmy Butler's left hip,
right?
And so Butler is obviously thinking, you got to start processing all these things. Like, I got to either cut off the way to the screen or I got to find a way to get over the top of it because I'm guarding Harden. And what I saw Harden doing numerous times was rejecting the screen and then going to Butler's right hip. And so now Butler ends up being at least a half a step slow. And so all it takes is another quick dribble, which Harden can do. And then all of a sudden he's got him on his butt. So what I really think is it's about really early communication from Towns, if he's the one on Capella, and Butler working together to let him know that the screen is coming early, when it's coming, and Butler needs to execute that defense of the pick and roll, or he needs to do better of staying in front of Harden if the screen isn't coming. And so, I mean, that's the inherent difficulty in Harden is he has numerous different ways he can beat you, of course, over the course of a game. But there's numerous different ways he can beat you inside of one action. Mm-hmm. And that is what is so hard as a defender, because you say, normally the goal of a defender is, I'm taking this away on this possession. Mm-hmm. But with Harden, you take one thing away, and he has another thing that he does just as well. So it's a terribly, terribly difficult job for any of them to guard him. And Harden was a full MVP. In ways during that game, I mean, I'm seeing his point total tick up towards 44, and I'm thinking he could do more. Like in the second and third quarter, I'm like, they should just all run through Harden. Like there's these stints where he's not really even like the main point, and I'm like, this could be a 50, 60 point game if they just went only through Harden, which is scary. And that's just that's a compliment to him, even more so than I think it is a rip on any of the Wolves defenders on him.
And I think Derrick Rose said something really interesting just about not just Harden, but the Rockets as a whole. He compared playing the Rockets to playing like the LeBron, Wade, Bosh Heat when he was in Chicago. He essentially, and it goes back to the whole, I mean, they lost by 3. Butler had a chance to tie it at the end. He stepped way over the line on the shot, so even had it gone in, it wouldn't have tied the game. But what he more or less said was, when you're playing a team like that, you really need to step. The second that you're tied up with them, I can pull up the quote because I'm fumbling a little bit. But
what he was saying is you keep the game close. The goal against an elite team is to keep the game close and out-execute them down the final stretch of the game. And I think he is what kept the Wolves close.
Yep.
And recognizing that is the Wolves probably can't go blow for blow with the Rockets and just beat them over the course of time. So it's about staying close and then bringing your best game for the final 2 minutes and winning that stretch by...
He said stay close, exactly. So the quote is, against a high-powered team, you have to stay with them for the entire game. I remember in the playoffs against Miami, the only thing you wanted to do is stay close until the fourth quarter, or if you get the lead before, which the Wolves had, you sustain it and try to make it larger, build on the lead. So the Wolves, I'm not sure what their biggest lead was. It couldn't have been more than 3, I would assume, or 4. They were able to sustain it for a good chunk of the game, but I think towards the end, when Butler isn't looking totally healthy and James Harden is looking like his best self, I mean, there's very little they can do. So I think this is another example of the Wolves playing pretty well against the Rockets. The only difference this time is the Rockets weren't making their threes. So in past games, when they've played Houston, and I've said this on previous pods, I don't think the Wolves have ever played that badly against Houston. Like, they've had some bad losses on the scoreboard, but when I've gone back and watched those games, I haven't left thinking like, man, the Wolves played like crap. I've left thinking, man, the Rockets are like an impossible team to beat. And it goes back to this. When the Rockets aren't making their threes, they still have James Harden as like the most hilariously unfair fallback option to just take over and dominate. In past games in the regular season, I mean, Harden has definitely stepped up in some games and been part of it, but it was the three-point shooting that the Rockets are also elite at, where even when the Wolves have stayed with them and kept it close, I mean, you just throw it out to Ryan Anderson or Eric Gordon or James Harden.
And all of a sudden, 3.
And then it's suddenly a 12, 15-point game. The Wolves kept it more interesting this time because the threes weren't going in. So, I mean, simple 3 versus 2 math wasn't able to completely kill them. But
the demoralization of 3 straight Rockets threes seems to affect the Wolves.
Yep, exactly.
If you watch those games, that's what happened, and that wasn't there in Game 1 of the playoffs, which is what kept the Wolves in it. And what we know over the course of the series is the 3 straight Rockets threes is going to happen. 4 or 5 might even happen. How are the Wolves going to respond to that? And are they going to make that be a 15-5 run, or are they going to make it be a 15-10 run? And that's going to be the difference in, as Rose said, keeping the game close within reason. And I'm interested to see that. We could probably have Ryan Anderson back. D'Antoni said before and after the game that it seems like Anderson's questionable for Game 2, and then he said definitely be back for Game 3. So that's coming, and he murdered the Wolves. What is also coming is probably just better three-point shooting from everyone else. So that's going to be, that's what's going to kind of make or break the Wolves here. I did, just wrapping up on Rose, wanted to talk about him a little bit more because I thought it was really interesting to just watch Derrick Rose during the game on and off the court. His behavior was bizarre.
Weird. Yeah, you pointed that out. He was, so if I recall, it was the third or fourth quarter, maybe the beginning of the fourth.
Yeah.
They were all in a huddle. Rose had just had a huge impact on the third quarter, but Rose was sitting by himself with his head down
during a timeout,
not talking to anybody.
Yeah.
And then he went to the locker room for a while.
He went to the locker room twice. It was weird. One time he went to the locker room, and then he just came back like 3 minutes later. And another time he went to the locker room and came back with like a foam roller stick.
Right.
Which is, players don't usually leave the bench. It happened to be right next to where our seats were in the media section.
Maybe Aaron Brooks was missing it. I don't know.
Yeah. It seems like something you could probably just ask a trainer to go get. But his behavior was just bizarre. I remember looking at the very beginning of the game, like the ball was just tipped, and kind of how NBA benches work is you're way down at the baseline, and if you were the person at the very end of the bench, you're essentially in the stands, next to fans, and that's where Derrick Rose was sitting. And I thought maybe this meant that he wasn't going to be in the rotation at the beginning of the game.
Yeah,
and I it was just. It was bizarre. His body language looked like he was very upset, but then he comes into the game and he's the most vocal in the timeouts when he is playing. He's in the huddle clapping and yelling and trying to energize his team. But then if he's out, when he's not out and not in the 5 players who are playing, he just goes to the end of the bench and again sits there, hands crossed, head down at the ground. And I don't know. I mean, maybe that's the fact that it's really hard for him to handle a playoff game and being in a minimized role, because you look at the role he played in Chicago before is, he's playing 35, 40, 45 minutes in those playoff games, and now he's forced to, even last night he played a ton, but it was only 25 minutes. And I'm assuming that's maybe hard for him.
Oh, and to be clear, I mean, we've talked about Rose a lot and how his role expanded in this game. Tibbs still used Jeff Teague, with the exception of the foul trouble that forced him out, as essentially not just the preference, but like the only option when Chris Paul was on the floor. The second Chris Paul came back into the game into the first half, Tyus was out, and not Rose, but Teague was back in. So
alongside Rose,
right? Yep. As the point guard, Teague still seems to be the one guy that Tibbs trusts fully. Right now, that could change, and it seems like Tibbs is trusting Rose more and more with bigger situations.
Yep.
And that goes back to the regular season. But as of right now, it looks like Teague is still the one guy that Tibbs trusts out there against Chris Paul, which I don't think the Wolves have an answer for Chris Paul when he starts playing better, because we've talked about Butler's struggles and we've talked about Towns' struggles, but Chris Paul didn't play like himself either. Mm-hmm. So if that starts happening in game 2 or beyond, I mean, I'll be interested to see how Teague or Tyus or Rose defend an on-point Chris Paul, because that's coming.
Well, and another point we kind of alluded to this is that Tyus Jones wasn't used at all at the 2 guard. Mm-hmm. The Rockets don't have a small enough 2 guard for Tyus to guard, so he can't necessarily play alongside Teague, and I'm pretty sure he didn't in this game, but Rose can,
right?
Or at least Tibbs believes he can, because he's bigger, more physical, than Tyus is. I know, obviously, Jones's defensive stats are great this year, but there seems to be a higher level of physicality in Rose. So I think if we're kind of guesstimating going forward, I don't see the role for Tyus Jones expanding much more than it was. And also, it doesn't help that I think he had 0 points, 1 assist, and I mean, he was kind of a solid role player, but I wouldn't necessarily say he was extremely impactful.
His 1 assist was made because Rose was streaking down the floor, and I mean, me and Chase Frederick of the Pioneer Press were talking about it. Like, he zoomed down there. He ran past everybody, and I didn't realize he was still that fast until that play.
He is the fastest player in the series, end-to-end speed. I think just
probably
running. I mean, if it's literally just a sprint, and to me that kind of, let's zoom back a month and a half to when Rose came, and I think you and I were both kind of concerned about who he was as a player, and some of those inefficiencies still bear out, and I think that was a big part of our concern. But naturally, we also had physical concerns about Derrick Rose given his injury history. And I think this game and a lot of Rose's other play has shown that he's pretty healthy. Yeah. And he's pretty close physically to the athlete, he once was. And that's a surprising development, given the fact that he's had this myriad of injuries. But I don't know. I think it's just a testament to Rose for, maintaining that, being engaged. He's been impressive. We pointed out that his limitations hurt the Wolves in ways, notably his shooting. I think that was the biggest issue.
And shot selection, I think.
And shot selection. I mean, he led the team in usage percentage, which is...
That's not what you want.
Not what you want, particularly when you have Towns and Butler both under 15%, and he's at 30% in usage. But really, the Derrick Rose signing looks like a very good move by Tibbs, given it was past the buyout deadline, and they had to bring someone in, and Rose has given them something. Gave them something in the playoffs. Maybe it didn't lead to a win, but if we're taking silver linings from this game, the Wolves have to have the mentality that they can compete with the Rockets. And I think if you remove Derrick Rose from the equation in that game, I don't think you have that sentiment going forward to game 2. I think it's probably a loss by 10, 15, 20 points without Rose, because I think he was that valuable. So if nothing else, for a guy that was brought in to play the final 6 weeks of the season, that's a pretty discernible piece of value that he's brought into the team.
So, Game 2 is on Wednesday. The Timberwolves are not practicing today, Monday, which means Jimmy Butler has a chance to rest. If he's truly hurt right now, or still, hurting, recovering, whatever you want to call it, we don't know this for sure. Of course, Tibbs hasn't talked about any declines or anything. It's just total eye test. He didn't look like himself.
You mentioned that alley-oop play. What I noticed was a couple of loose ball plays, particularly early on in the game, kind of those 50-50 balls. And you think about Jimmy Butler as this dog who's just going to go after them. And a couple of times I saw reservation in that, which would make sense because what's going to happen in those situations? You're going to collide with the other player that you're, and so maybe Butler is just thinking, or even subconsciously thinking that, a collision increases my odds of re-injuring my knee. And that's just kind of the normal psychology of returning from a pretty serious injury. And so maybe it is that he is healthy, but he's just not all mentally there.
Yeah.
Or confidence-wise in his health. I don't know. But like you said, we're speculating and guessing. But I don't know. That'll be interesting to see. And Butler's used this line before that sometimes it's just worth risking it for a biscuit. And we'll see if
quoted by the great Nate Robinson.
Yeah, we'll see if that happens in Game 2. I think he will. I mean, he's gonna have to go back to his hotel tonight and realize that the Wolves need more out of him.
Yeah, and he knows that too because after the game he more or less said that. Mm-hmm. He said, "I didn't do well." It was the questions were more pertaining to his defense on James Harden, which I mean. He didn't. Harden dominated that game. I'm not sure, a healthy Jimmy Butler would have stopped very much of it, but I think it would have made a difference. The bigger question, I think, or the bigger sign from that is Butler was very unsatisfied from that game of him personally. So
as he should be.
Yeah, right. And if you want a silver lining, an ultimate silver lining, the Wolves lost this game to Houston by 3. And Jimmy Butler seemed frustrated after the game. When that happens, or when that's happened this season, that usually results in an uptick in production the following game. So I think the odds are good that we're going to see a better version of Jimmy Butler in Game 2. And I think the odds of Karl Anthony Towns producing offensively the way he did in Game 1 happening again, I think are very low.
Very low. I think
the odds, the counter to that, of course, I think the odds of Wiggins having as productive a start as he had in Game 1. I guess we have no sample of him in the playoffs outside of Game 1, so we don't know what we're going to get from him, but that's part of the question. And I mentioned it earlier, but you wrote about that in detail, how we don't really know yet.
We don't know. I wasn't necessarily surprised to see that from Wiggins early on. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Towns come out and be assertive early and often in that game. There's still going to be the double teams. He's still going to be guarded by Clint Capella. But what I think about is, I think it would have been 3 weeks ago now when the Wolves lost to Memphis and Towns had they lost to Memphis at home. Towns had a really bad game, really struggled in the fourth quarter.
Yep.
And we saw him come back on Wednesday and score 56 points against the Atlanta Hawks. Now, the difference is he's being defended by Mike Muscala in that game versus Clint Capella and the Houston Rockets. But I would assume that Towns is going to bring the level of energy that he did and the level of confidence. He doesn't strike me as someone who's going to put forth 4 straight stinkers in these playoffs. I think he will come out and be assertive, and he has the talent to obviously score over Clint Capella. He's a dominant offensive player. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a very big Karl Anthony Towns game in Game 2.
So if you had to guess, I think the over-under has improved from 11.5 to 10.5 in Game 2. How do you feel about it?
I still think that is a bet on the Rockets to take the Rockets minus 10.5 is a bet on a blowout because, I mean, what often happens, to win on that type of spread is that they get up by 20 points and maybe kind of let the game down a bit at the end and end up winning by 14 or whatever. I don't know. I'm not convinced that this Rockets team is going to totally blow out the Wolves. I'm not predicting the Wolves will win, but I think the only way they blow out the Wolves is if they have that extremely high level of 3-point shooting on a high volume. That's how they blow them out. If there is anything to the sense that the Wolves are defending the three better, then this game can stay within single digits.
Yep.
The expectation still has to be that the Rockets win, but I would take the Wolves and the points there. It's just that's a ton for a playoff game.
That is a lot.
And Mike D'Antoni said after the game, and I thought was interesting too, is that he goes, "We're not viewing this team as an 8 seed." He goes, "We know we're the 1 seed and they were the 8 seed, but we're not. They were when Jimmy Butler was there, they were the 3 seed for a chunk of the season." And he was like, "We kind of got a bad draw in the fact that we got a team that normally you would expect to play in the lighter rounds of the playoffs." And so I think there's something to that. And the Wolves are clicking. They're not on the level of the Rockets because the Rockets are the best team in the NBA, but they're better than the normal 8 seed. And so I think it should be competitive, and to assume blowouts, I don't think that's a more than 50% probability.
So we've looked at this playoff push the whole year from the Wolves' perspective. Who's the worst team to play? Houston, obviously. Golden State would be right up there with them in terms of just you don't want to play them. If you wanted to draw to try to get Portland or a 4-5 game, they got the Rockets. Until D'Antoni said that, and I was just about to bring that up, I haven't thought about it from the perspective of your Golden State, Houston, Portland's. If you're them, between Denver, San Antonio without Kawhi, who it's reported he's not playing in the playoffs now, New Orleans, and then Minnesota, who just got Butler back and finished the season out undefeated with Butler back 3 games, mind you, so it's not a ton. I think the Wolves are the scariest of that group. I think you can make the case just in terms of star power and top to bottom talent, the starting lineup. I think you can make a strong case that of that group, the Wolves are the toughest out, or will give you a lot of tough games. So,
other than maybe New Orleans, I just think Anthony Davis. Anthony Davis isn't going to do what Towns did in the game. And when you said top to bottom talent,
but I think the counter. I don't think Towns is Minnesota's Anthony Davis. But then to that point, Jimmy Butler didn't show up either. So yeah. I mean, there's that too.
Right, and I think that the Wolves have put out 5 players who can hurt you when pretty much at all times, and the Pelicans don't necessarily have that, but I just think Anthony Davis would handle the double teams a lot.
You're absolutely
a lot better than Towns did.
You're totally right. My point is more that if you're Houston and you see of all those teams that were competing for seeds 4 through, or maybe not 4 because Utah just got smoked by Oklahoma City, but through the regular season anyway, those sort of teams that were in the 6, 7, 8 area, Minnesota. I think if you're one of those teams, I think you can make a strong case that Minnesota is the scariest draw, or might give you the most trouble, just based on their early regular season play.
Yeah, and it's just the only reason you wouldn't is because the Wolves got crushed in the 4 times that they played the Rockets,
and their defense wasn't very good.
Yeah,
there's a million sides to it. All those teams were flawed to a very strong degree. All those teams that were competing for the spots that the Wolves ended up in, but. To the Wolves' credit, they only lost by 3 in that game 1, and that was with Butler struggling and maybe looking still a little injured. That was with Towns struggling.
What do you think will happen in game 2?
I think Houston. I just don't trust Houston to shoot 10 of 37 or of that way. Even if the Wolves defend the 3 well, I don't expect Houston to just throw out another dud of an outside shooting performance. All of their recent history suggests that that's not going to happen throughout the entire season. Even without Anderson, Eric Gordon wasn't making his threes. PJ Tucker wasn't making his threes. Chris Paul was non-existent. So as much as I'm pleased by the way the Wolves played despite Butler and Towns not showing up, there were guys on Houston that normally show up that did not. So Harden bailed them out of this one. I don't expect the rest of the starting lineup to struggle. Capella and Harden removed the way they did in game 1. So if I had to pick, I'm not as big on the spread despite the fact that I brought it up myself. I'm arguing with myself. I'm taking taking your thing.
No, I think
I think the Rockets are going to win by double digits in game 2.
And I'm with Chris Paul. The one bit of, and I think this isn't just with what you said, but kind of what tracking Twitter and such is, that Chris Paul didn't play well, and obviously we look at the stat sheet, he had a lot of turnovers. That is true, but I think there's also a sense of that he's like selfless enough and aware enough to say this wasn't my opportunity to be the focal point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I do think is that he can take the step up if the situation calls for it. If the Wolves make some sort of counters or what have you that kind of change the dynamic of the game. Chris Paul is still a looming giant in this. I know you're not disagreeing with that. I'm just pointing that out that Chris Paul could be a lot more, and I think should almost be the assumption if the Wolves do need that, because we saw very little of him in isolation for as much isolation as we saw Harden dominate. I mean, Paul can be nearly as dominant offensively in isolation as he was. So I have, that's kind of that for me. The 3-point shooting and more of an emergence from Chris Paul, I think, could be the reason that the Wolves kind of get, I don't want to say blown out, but a bigger difference in this game. And I would assume one of those two things happen.
So my whole point with Chris Paul not playing well, and I think the point of even Chris Paul saying after the game, he, not just the turnovers, but let's say you cut those turnovers in half. That's 3 more possessions without a turnover. With Houston's offensive potency, maybe the game isn't by single digits. Maybe it's not by 3.
Mm-hmm.
He also shot 1 of 6 from deep. Like that's what I'm going back to. When you take out James Harden, the starting lineup shot. Oh God, I'm doing math in my head. 2 of 15 from deep. I just don't expect that to happen.
They were 2 of 25 as a team, other than Harden from deep.
Yeah.
3 of 25, other than Harden from deep.
I think the Wolves defended the 3 pretty well. I thought it's not like he's a daunting matchup or anything, but Wiggins, I thought, played really good defense on Trevor Ariza. He never let him get an open look. So, to his credit, that's great. I just don't, again, coming back to it, I don't expect that starting lineup to struggle the way they did. Again, James Harden is good enough where he can bail them out, and he did. He made up for all the problems that they had with their 3-point shooting. But if I had to bet, I think Houston's going to win this game by double digits. I do think the Wolves are good enough to make it interesting and prove me wrong. They proved me wrong in game 1. I expect them to lose by double digits in game 1. But Houston's track record is stronger and more consistent than Minnesota. So if I'm going off of that, I got to pick Houston to win by a good amount.
What's one kind of, and we'll kind of wrap up on this because I think we're getting there.
Yep.
What's one Wolves-related thing that you're specifically looking for in game 2, whether it be a player or kind of shift, maybe a philosophical shift for game 2?
I just want to see Aaron Brooks get some minutes.
Who has cornrows, by the way, which is sweet.
Oh, man, we should have led with that.
Yes.
It's Butler for me.
Mm.
I don't expect him to do what he did, or I don't expect him to lock down James Harden. That's not what I'm expecting of him. I'm not even expecting him to slow down James Harden. I feel like when he's on and he's making the threes that he made in game 1, 44 points is going to be hard to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to see how he comes out in game 2
defensively.
Offensively.
Okay, yep.
Because, I mean, we've speculated his health throughout this whole podcast, but I hate speculating about health because I never know. We never know, especially when the coaching staff doesn't talk about it. So if he's healthy, I expect a huge swing in the way that he plays in game 2. But if he's not diving for the loose balls that he generally dives for, if he's not finishing at the rim the way he generally does, I think that is going to be pretty telling for the rest of the series, because if we don't have a fully active and a regular Jimmy Butler, this is going to be a long series, despite the fact that it would probably be a sweep. It's going to feel like a long series. I'll put it that way. So I'm looking at Jimmy Butler's offense and the way I guess his intangibles that we're used to seeing. If that's back in game 2, I'll feel better about the Wolves being able to steal a game.
I have one too, but just on Butler, on a per minute basis, he shoots the least shots in the first quarter compared to other quarters. And I think that part of that is he's trying to get Andrew going, trying to get Towns going. And we know Taj often shoots a lot in the first quarter.
Sure does.
I wonder if we don't see Butler come out early and try and assert his will offensively. I would think that, that would probably be a good thing to not necessarily sacrifice for those other guys early on in the game, so as to get them going. It might just be important to get Butler going and know that the Wolves probably need to win a 30-point Butler performance on over 50% shooting.
I mean, I could see him or Towns coming out super aggressive. You've mentioned him at the beginning or in the middle. At some point in this podcast, it's all clumping together. But, I mean, they both scored fewer points than we're used to them scoring. Mm-hmm. So whether one of them takes that performance personally, just on themselves, or takes it hard, I could see either one or both of them come out pretty strongly in the first quarter.
Right. My one adjustment I'm looking for, and I'm not sure if it'll happen or not, but is a possibility that one of, I may not be elite, so Tyus Jones or Gorgui Dieng are removed from the rotation. Mm. 10 guys played. That's a lot of guys to play, in the playoffs. And I mean, those guys have all shown to be impactful from time to time, but I wonder if there won't be an adjustment so as to limit them even further or remove one of them altogether from the rotation, because we saw the end of first quarter, end of third quarter rotations, and you had like the entire bench in there, or 4 of the 5 of them in there at a time, and the Wolves just got out executed down the stretch of quarters. And I don't think that should happen. I don't think they should all be in there, and I would like to see the rotation shift in a way, even if those 10 guys all play, that we don't ever see 4 or 5 of them out on the court at the same time. So I'm looking for the possibility that a few of those guys don't play. I think they're all helpful players, but maybe it's time to cut down the rotations. And for all the hand-wringing there's been over Tibbs's minutes over the course of the season, they were all very reasonable in Game 1. And the counter-argument is that there's way more rest days here, and playing your starters heavier minutes in the playoffs makes sense, just as much as playing your bench heavier minutes in the regular season does. I know it's that Miami series that Derrick Rose was talking about after the game. You go through those game logs, and Jimmy Butler played the entirety of 3 of those 5 games against Miami, 48 minutes.
It's always been that way, too. The Stars play a ton. James Harden led Game 1 in minutes. Mm-hmm. I mean, it wasn't a Timberwolves player, for whatever it's worth.
Right, and I think that it's fair to ask 40 minutes of all the starters if they're playing well. And that's another reason for my question about Jimmy's health and stamina and all those things is can he give the Wolves 45 minutes if they need it? I don't know. If I knew he was healthy, I would love to see Butler play over 40 minutes and the rest of the starters, because the Wolves had the second worst bench out of all the playoff teams.
Yep. And
to play them and expect to even be passable or operate at a 0 is, I mean, that's too big of an ask. There's not enough talent. There's certainly not the playoff experience there. I'm looking for Tibbs to possibly shorten that rotation, and I actually think that would be a good idea.
I think you're right. So Game 2 on Wednesday, the Wolves aren't practicing today, so they got a couple days off, and then they're back at it, and then we're back. Or they're back, and we're back on Thursday in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll have some stuff here in the next couple days, after having a chance to dig into Game 1 a little bit more. Dave Benz is here with us in Houston. We're hoping to do a podcast with him. He said we could do it by the pool. We'll see if that happens. We'll do
it somewhere. It might not be by a pool. We'll see. Yeah, we're gonna try to get Dave on, maybe some other friends if they're around.
Yeah.
But until then, follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, @ZoneCoverageMN. Mm-hmm. Subscribe to us on iTunes. Please
use the promo code Houston if you want to give Dane and Tim a little kickback.
Yeah, if you like us, become a member at Zone Coverage. It's right at the top of zonecoverage.com. Use the promo code Houston, You get it? It's because we're in Houston.
We are drinking Starbucks right now, and both of our Starbucks cost more than a month subscription to ZoneCoverage.com, which gets you coverage of not only the Minnesota Timberwolves, but as you mentioned, excellent NFL coverage and NFL draft coverage. It's just a good place on the internet to read about Minnesota sports. I'm impressed by all the work they do there. So thank you for always listening to us and supporting us in the ways that you feel like you can.
Perfectly said. Yeah, I will not add to that. Well, I'll say, past NFL, we've got, honestly, I'm not sure that there's a site right now that covers as actively as they do. The Timberwolves, the Vikings, the Twins, the Wild, Gopher basketball, Gopher football, and the Minnesota Lynx. I mean, we have stuff on. We had a pre-draft thing for the Minnesota Lynx. We had a post-draft thing. We had an exclusive interview with Cheryl Reeves. So we got every sport and every topic that you need. Minnesota United, they played.
I think bottom line, we're trying.
We're doing our best. Please help us try even harder. Anyway, that's been another edition of Wolves Wired. We'll stop begging. So for Dane Moore at Dane Moore NBA, I'm Tim Faklis at TIMFAKLIS. From Houston, we'll see you next time.